Okay, hello everybody. So today we are going to learn about women's rights. So our objectives are to analyze the impact of changes in women's education on women's roles in society. We're also going to be able to explain, well, you guys are going to be able to explain what women did to win workers' rights to improve family life. And we're going to evaluate the tactics women had to use in order to win the passage of the 19th Amendment, which was the amendment of the Constitution that allowed women the right to vote. So just some terms and people just to familiarize yourselves with. I'm not going to, these aren't going to be on a quiz. These specific terms and people, just general what suffrage means. If suffrage means the right to vote, we went over that in our vocabulary. When we did the vocabulary when we first started the lesson, but some just terms and people that you want to familiarize yourselves with. I just want you guys to get like a basic sense of the women's rights movement. We could spend like a few weeks on it, but we don't have that type of time, unfortunately. So again, these are some of the terms and people that you want to know. Florence Kelly, she founded the National Consumer League. The National Consumer League was the group that labeled and publicized goods produced under fair, safe, and healthy working conditions. Because at this time, a lot of women, particularly young girls, were working in factories and in unsafe working conditions. The temperance movement. So, from Europeans are big drinkers. So when they came to the United States, they bought their habits, their drinking habits with them to the United States. So there was this movement by women called the temperance movement, and they wanted to limit alcohol use in society. And that's where we'll get when we talk about the 1920s, and some of you guys might even do a project on it about the prohibition of alcohol. So making alcohol illegal, which it was for about a decade in American history. Margaret Singer was a nurse who opened the first birth control clinic, and Ida B. Wells, who helped found the National Association of Colored Women. And suffrage, that term will be on your quiz. So that's the right to vote. And then I'm going to skip down to National American Women's Suffrage Association. So the group that worked on state and national levels to earn women the right to vote. And Alice Paul, she was one of the prime activists in the women's rights movement. She was a social activist and led women to picket at the White House to get the right to vote. And then the 19th Amendment, as I said, was passed in 1919. It was a constitutional amendment that granted women the right to vote. So how did women of the progressive era make progress and win the right to vote? So in the early 1900s, many women were no longer content with playing a limited role in society. So basically, women being housewives, wives, mothers, women wanted more rights. They wanted to be out in society rather than just being stuck in the home doing domestic work, cleaning, cooking, mothering, all that stuff. So they wanted to bring change during the progressive era. By the early 1900s, a growing number of middle-class women wanted to do more than be stay-at-home wives and mothers, as I said. So colleges like Pennsylvania, Byrd, Morrow, and New York's School of Social Work armed with middle-class women with education and modern ideas. And these having the power of education is one of the most powerful things that you can have. If you ever seen Outside My Door, for those of you that have been in my classroom physically, you'll see education is the greatest power. Quote, I'm not saying that verbatim, but it's powerful. Education is a very powerful asset to have. And they arm these women with these ideas for greater equality in society. But that was more for the middle class women. Poorer women And lower middle class women, they continue to work long hours in the factories and under very dangerous and dirty conditions. Progressive reforms addressed working women's conditions. They worked long hours in factories and sweatshops as maids, laundresses, or servants. So a sweatshop like building, making clothes for like 12 hours. You wouldn't get a break. Or 12 hours, 18 hours a day. Then you have to come back and for very minimum pay. They were paid less and often didn't get to keep their wages because they have to give wages because they had to find a place to live, and often they would live like on the factories. They were intimidated and bullied by employers, so these employers would like to hire women because, especially these immigrant women, because they felt they could, and they knew that they could take advantage of these women. Reformers saw limiting the length of women's workday as an important goal and succeeded in several states. So we're in Mueller versus Oregon. So that was a Supreme Court case. The Supreme Court ruled that states could legally limit a woman's workday. This ruling would recognize the unique role of women as mothers. In 1899, Florence Kelley helped found the National Consumers League, which aimed to make workplaces safer and urged women to buy products made in safe conditions. She also founded the Women's Trade Union League, which worked for a federal minimum wage. Remember, we talked a little bit about the minimum wage and why we have a minimum wage and what the purpose is, and an actual 8-hour workday. The organization also helped to support families who refused to work and on safe and unfair conditions. So again, progressives, they supported the temperance movement. So they felt alcohol often led the men to spend their earnings. So the women worked all those hours, then they have to give the money to the men. And what are they spending it on? Alcohol and liquor. So they neglect their families and abuse their lives. So they wanted to get alcohol out of society. The Women's Christian Temperance Union grew steadily until the passage of the 18th Amendment, which banned the sale and production of alcohol in 1919. And we'll talk a little bit about prohibition later on. So in 1916, Margaret Sanger opened the first birth control clinic because she believed that having fewer children would lead to healthier women. So she was jailed. The courts eventually ruled that doctors could give out family planning information. In 1921, she founded the American Birth Control League to make information available to women. So African Americans also worked for women's rights. IDB Wells founded the National Association of Colored Women in 1896. The organization supported daycare centers for children of working parents so women could go to work and have their kids taken care of. Wells also worked for suffrage to end lynchings because lynchings was something that was very prevalent in the South. So African Americans were lynched, especially, for example, African American men. So an African American men, if they were looking at a Caucasian woman just caught glancing and she saw and she accused him of staring her down, they would get lynched in the public square. And she wanted to stop segregation in Chicago schools. Ultimately, suffrage was seen as the only way to ensure that government protected children, fostered education, and supported family life. So they believed the key for women's rights was the right to vote, because then they could elect people who will advocate for them in legislatures and Congress and ultimately the White House. Since the 1860s, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Stanton worked relentlessly for women's suffrage, or the right to vote. And that's an important word, and that will be on your quiz. By the 1890s, only Wyoming and Colorado allowed women to vote. In the 1890s, Carrie Catt, president of the National American Suffrage Association, promoted the two-part strategy for women. So the organization lobbied the NAWSA, lobbied Congress for a constitutional amendment for women the right to vote, and supporters called for suffragees to use the referendum process to pass state laws. So a referendum process is when people vote. So you can vote for a law. They'll have this, for example, a lot of states had referendums this past election for legalized marijuana. So it'll ask on a voter ballot, it would say, for example, do you support legalizing recreational use of marijuana? It would be yes or no. That's what a referendum is. So it's basically voting on a law. In 1917, social activists led by Alice Paul formed the National Woman's Party. Their radical actions made the suffrage movement's goals seem less dramatic by comparison. They picketed at the White House. Hundreds of suffragists were arrested in jail. So Alice Paul was more of an extreme activist. She definitely had different methods from other suffragists. But an important thing to remember, not all women supported suffrage. The National Association opposed to women's suffrage, feared voting would distract women for their families. So just because a lot of women wanted the right to vote doesn't mean that everybody was with it. So some women have more of the conservative view that women belong in the house, they belong to clean, they belong to cook, they belong as mothers and wives. So for them to have the right to vote, that would very distract them from that duty. So they believed they were totally against it. And men and women were offended by Paul's protests in front of the White House. A mob shredded her signs and pickets. I don't know why the rest of the slides are not coming up. I'm going to have an exit ticket for you guys. And of course, thank you for watching.